Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that's been making waves in the gaming world. It's all about Ubisoft and their restructuring. We've got this article here from Video Games Chronicle VGC confirming that 185 employees are being laid off by Ubisoft. So yeah, big story, obviously going to have ripple effects. We're going to try to understand the human side of it all. You know what it means for the people involved. And then also what it might tell us about Ubisoft's plans and maybe even the future of the whole gaming scene.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack here. Layoffs are always a tough thing to process. And when it's a company as big as Ubisoft, it really makes you think.
Exactly. So let's get right into the specifics. According to this VGC article, Ubisoft is letting go of 185 employees, and that's across a few of their studios in Europe. We're talking Dusseldorf, Stockholm Reflections. And then there's Leamington. Leamington is actually being shut down completely. And, that was formerly Freestyle Games, the folks who brought us DJ Hero, right? And they've worked on some huge titles like Far Cry 5 and even that upcoming Star Wars Outlaws game. I just can't imagine what those developers are going through.
It's got to be rough. And it really drives home this point, that there are real people behind all these games and these industry shifts. It's easy to get lost in the hype of new releases and all that, but these decisions affect real lives.
It really makes you stop and think. Here's a studio that's been part of some of gaming's biggest franchises, and now they're facing closure. It makes you wonder if a studio with that kind of history can be vulnerable, then what does it mean for everyone else?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it reflects a lot of the anxieties people are feeling across the industry as a whole. It's not just Ubisoft. We've seen other studios, both big and small, having to make similar tough choices. Layoffs, restructuring, sometimes even shutting down completely.
Yeah.
It's definitely got a lot of folks concerned.
Absolutely. It makes you want to understand, what's behind these decisions. The VGC article says that Ubisoft's main reason for the layoffs is to prioritize projects and reduce costs. What do you think? Is that just corporate jargon or is there more to it?
Well, it might sound like the usual corporate talk on the surface, but I think there's probably more to it than that. When a company, especially one like Ubisoft, talks about prioritizing projects, it often means they're changing their overall strategy. And when they talk about reducing costs, well, usually that's a sign that they're trying to deal with some financial challenges behind the scenes.
So you're saying it's not just about streamlining things, there's a bigger picture here.
I think so. If you look at Ubisoft's performance lately, they've had a few big releases that didn't quite meet expectations. Like Skull and Bones, for example, had a really troubled development. And even though they managed to launch it in the end, it didn't really seem to make the impact they were hoping for. And then you have some of their long-running franchises like Assassin's Creed. They're still popular, but it feels like maybe there's a bit of franchise fatigue setting in. Right. People are still enjoying the games, but maybe not with the same level of enthusiasm as before.
Yeah, it does seem like the whole gaming landscape is shifting. And some of those older ways of doing things might not be working as well anymore.
Exactly. And that's where I think these strategic options that Ubisoft mentioned in the article come in. They're looking for ways to adapt to this new reality. And one of the biggest possibilities that people are talking about is this potential partnership with Tencent.
Oh, right. The Tencent rumors. That's a pretty big deal, right? I mean, Tencent is a massive force in gaming.
Huge.
They're involved in pretty much everything.
They are. And if they end up getting involved with Ubisoft, it could really shake things up.
So what would a partnership like that even look like?
Well, it's still early days, and the exact details are a bit unclear. But the report suggests that Tencent might team up with the Guillemot family, the founders of Ubisoft. They might create a new venture together that would include some of Ubisoft's assets.
So not a complete takeover then, more like a joint venture.
Yeah, that seems to be the most likely scenario right now. And it's a move that makes sense for a few different reasons. For Ubisoft, a partnership like that with Tencent could give them some much-needed financial stability and resources. Tencent's got deep pockets, and they're not afraid to invest for the long haul. Plus, we can't forget about Tencent's global reach, especially in places like China, where Ubisoft hasn't really been able to break through.
Right, so it sounds like a win-win in a way. Ubisoft gets financial support and access to new markets, and Tencent gets a piece of a major gaming company with a history of making hit games.
Yeah, on the surface, it definitely looks that way. But just like with any big business deal, there are some potential risks to think about.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about that. What are some of the downsides here?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is what could happen to Ubisoft's creative independence. Tencent is known for being pretty hands-on with their investments. Some might even say they're a bit controlling.
So you're saying there's a chance that Ubisoft games might start to feel less Ubisoft-y?
It's possible. And it's something that a lot of Ubisoft fans are worried about. Ubisoft has a really distinct style,
Yeah.
you know, something that sets them apart. Their games are often ambitious, sometimes a little quirky, and they really love that open world design.
Yeah.
More than almost anyone else, it's hard to say if they'll be able to keep that unique identity with Tencent in the picture.
It's interesting because this whole situation with Ubisoft feels like a smaller version of this bigger trend we're seeing in gaming, this clash between creativity and commerce. You have all these incredibly talented developers building these amazing, immersive worlds, and then you have these giant corporations with their focus on profits and the bottom line, trying to figure out how to make as much money as possible. It's a tricky balancing act.
It really is, and I think that tension is only going to get stronger in the next few years. Making AAA games is just getting more and more expensive. You've got huge teams, cutting-edge technology development cycles that can last for years. It's a massive gamble financially, and even a studio as established as Ubisoft isn't immune to that pressure.
So if that traditional AAA model is becoming unsustainable, what's the alternative? I mean, we still want those big budget, amazing games, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't think AAA games are going away anytime soon, but I think we're going to see studios trying out different approaches, finding ways to create those immersive experiences without spending a fortune. We're already seeing a trend towards shorter, more focused AAA games, like Kena, Bridge of Spirits, or Stray, for example. Those games offered really polished experiences, but without the massive scope of a traditional open-world game.
Yeah. And both of those games got rave reviews. It shows that you don't need a 100-hour epic to make something memorable.
Right. And then there's the whole rise of games as a service, which is something Ubisoft has already embraced with games like Rainbow Six Siege. These games generate revenue over a longer period of time through things like microtransactions, season passes, expansions, that kind of thing. It works really well for online multiplayer games because you can keep players engaged for years with regular content updates and new challenges.
It's funny because that games as a service model feels kind of like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it can lead to games that are always evolving and growing, with dedicated communities that stick around for years. But on the other hand, it can also feel like you're stuck on this never-ending treadmill of content, always feeling pressured to spend more money to keep up.
Yeah, that's a valid point. And I think it's something that game developers need to be careful about. It's all about finding that balance, creating games that are engaging and rewarding, but without feeling like they're exploiting players.
I think that's a good approach for the whole industry, really. Finding that balance, embracing new ideas, but not losing sight of what makes games special. The creativity, the passion, the ability to transport us to new worlds and experiences.
I agree. And speaking of new worlds and experiences, remember that VGC article we were talking about earlier? The one about Ubisoft's restructuring and the potential partnership with Tencent? There's this really interesting detail in there that I think we should mention. Tencent's global ambitions.
Oh, right. They're not just content with being a giant in China. They want to take over the world, right?
Well, they definitely seem to be moving in that direction. They've been buying up stakes in gaming companies all over the place. They're like the gaming equivalent of a venture capitalist, spreading their investments far and wide.
That raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? I mean, is all this consolidation a good thing for the industry? Will it lead to more diversity and new ideas? Or will it just create a situation where a handful of mega corporations control everything?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's a complicated issue with no easy answers. On the one hand, having a company like Tencent invest in studios all over the world could give those studios resources and opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. It could lead to more collaboration and the sharing of ideas across borders, and maybe even brand new gaming experiences.
But on the other hand, there's that worry that too much consolidation could stifle creativity. If a few big companies are calling all the shots, they might be more likely to play it safe and stick with established franchises instead of taking risks on new and innovative ideas.
I see your point. And I think that's something we as consumers need to be aware of. We need to support the studios that are willing to take risks, the ones that are pushing the boundaries of what games can be. We need to celebrate diversity and originality, and not just settle for the same old stuff.
It's like that saying, vote with your wallet, right? We have the power to shape the industry with the choices we make. If we want to see more diverse and innovative games, we need to support the developers who are making them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we need to keep having these conversations, thinking critically about what's shaping the industry and speaking up for the kind of gaming landscape we want to see.
Yeah, that's a great point. So all this talk about Tencent's ambitions and the future of gaming brings us back to Ubisoft.
It does, and it leaves us with a big question mark hanging over their heads.
What happens next? Yeah, what happens next for Ubisoft? I mean, we've talked about the layoffs, the potential Tencent partnership, all these big industry trends. It's a lot to take in.
It is. It feels safe to say that Ubisoft is at a crossroads right now. The choices they make over the next few months will have a big impact on their future, and maybe even on the industry as a whole.
Okay, so let's put on our prediction hats for a minute. What are some of the ways this could all play out?
Well, one possibility is that the deal with Tencent goes through, and they pump a ton of money into Ubisoft. That could lead to a period of stability and growth for them. They could invest in new tech, expand into new markets. They could become even bigger players on the global stage.
Okay, so that sounds like a pretty optimistic outcome, but I'm guessing there are some potential downsides to that scenario too.
Oh, of course. Like we talked about earlier, there's that concern that Tencent's influence could change Ubisoft's creative direction. They might start focusing on games that appeal to a wider global audience, maybe even at the expense of that unique style and innovation that Ubisoft is known for.
So we might see fewer of those quirky experimental titles like Beyond Good and Evil, and more of those big blockbuster franchises.
It's possible. And there's also the potential for culture clashes. Ubisoft's a European company with their own creative culture, and Tencent's a Chinese company with their own way of doing things. Trying to blend those two cultures could be tricky.
Makes you wonder if Ubisoft would be able to hold on to its identity under the umbrella of a giant company like Tencent.
A lot of Ubisoft fans are asking that same question. Guess we'll have to wait and see.
So what about other possibilities? What if the deal with Tencent falls apart?
Well, if that happened, Ubisoft would need to find another way to get through these tough times. They might have to make even more cuts, maybe even selling off some of their studios or intellectual property. It could be a period of downsizing and restructuring.
That doesn't sound too good.
It wouldn't be easy, that's for sure. But even in a less optimistic scenario, I don't think it's the end for Ubisoft. They have so much talent and such a strong lineup of games. They've been through difficult times before. They're good at adapting and coming up with new ideas.
So there's still hope.
Definitely. The gaming industry is always changing. New tech is coming out, player preferences are shifting, and there will always be opportunities for studios that are willing to embrace change and take risks.
I like that way of looking at it. It's not all doom and gloom. There's potential for excitement and innovation, even with all this uncertainty.
Exactly, and I think that's an important thing to remember for anyone who loves gaming. This industry is dynamic and unpredictable. That's what keeps things interesting.
Totally agree. And I think Ubisoft's situation reminds us that even the biggest companies aren't immune to these changes.
It shows us that success isn't guaranteed, and that adapting is essential for survival.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Ubisoft and the state of the gaming industry, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
I'd say this. The gaming landscape is constantly in motion. But even with all the uncertainty and change, one thing always stays the same. The power of creativity. The drive to make amazing and immersive experiences is what drives this industry. And that's something worth celebrating.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's always great to explore these topics with you.
Likewise. Until next time.
And to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.